Hi, I'm Doug from Dynamic Computing and welcome to episode 161 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. This week we're going to explore a fairly new addition to hard drive and SCSI options for your Amiga computer, and that is the ZuluSCSI. Cute little thing, isn't it? The ZuluSCSI is kind of a hybrid between two different SCSI technologies. The original SCSI to SD, which you see right here, and the blue SCSI, which is popular on the Macintosh retro platform, but also works on the Amiga. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but over the past couple of years, some parts have been a little hard to find in our industry, in the microchip industry, as in impossible to find. And so what they discovered is the parts for the SCSI to SD were getting more and more difficult to get at a reasonable price. So they combined these two different technologies, the SCSI to SD and the blue SCSI, in order to make a less expensive package with parts they could get off the shelf for a very reasonable price. One of the big differences of the ZuluSCSI over the SCSI to SD is how it handles its hard drive emulation, I guess you could call it. On the SCSI to SD, it pretty much took the SD card on there, and you had to hook up your SCSI to SD right to your PC with a USB card and use a special utility and say, okay, this is the size of my drive, and it would take over the SD card and basically consider it a reasonably sized hard drive on your machine. It worked great. And then the speed of the SCSI to SD was fine. Version 5.1, about 3 megabytes per second. Version 6 brought that up to 5 to 7 megabytes per second. Configuration of them could be fairly daunting for some people, and here's a review of it right here. But it could be fairly daunting because you actually have to take the SCSI to SD out, plug it into the USB drive or USB on your system, and then run this utility and get it set up right. It wasn't hard, but it was a little daunting to some people. So enter the ZuluSCSI, this little beauty right here. Look at that. Look at how cute it is. It's just adorable. RabbitHole Computing. In a lot of ways, the ZuluSCSI makes things a little bit easier. Now first, let's talk about the specs of the ZuluSCSI, and then we'll get into how to configure it. The ZuluSCSI can emulate up to 7 SCSI devices. So that means on one SD card, you can literally have 7 different hard drives virtualized on there. That's not 7 different partitions, because you can take those virtual hard drives and partition them any way you want to. But 7 actual virtual hard drives on there. They can be either hard drive images, which we'll talk about in a minute, ISO files for CD-ROMs. It can even emulate magneto-optical drives, tape drives, SCSI floppy drives. It can do some pretty clever things. It speaks both SCSI 1 and SCSI 2, and including fast SCSI 2, which is theoretically up to 10 megabytes per second. So realistically, it will absolutely be faster than a SCSI to SD 5.1, and the same speed or maybe slightly faster than a SCSI to SD 6.x. Theoretical speeds are 9.1 megabytes per second down and 6 megabytes per second upload. And that upload speed is dramatically better than the upload speed on the SCSI to SD. Now you notice there's a little power connector on here. Now generally, just like the SCSI to SD, your ZuluSCSI is going to get its power from the SCSI bus itself, so you'll probably never ever have to hook this up. But there are some SCSI cards that either don't provide any power or don't provide enough power to power this little guy, in which case get a floppy splitter, plug it in, you're golden. The firmware of this is also really upgradable. On the SCSI to SD, you'd have to take the unit out, plug it into your USB on your PC, and push the firmware to it. Again, not hard. But on here, you can just get a firmware file, an update file off the GitHub website, which I'll put in the description. Put it on the SD card, plug it in. It updates the firmware when you boot up your computer. It's really kind of cool. Now lastly, this has the same physical size as the SCSI to SD. So if you've got a cool 3D printed holder for yours, I've got a couple of them, the ZuluSCSI will fit right in it without having to change anything. That was a good plan. So physically, you just connect the ZuluSCSI, which you see I have right here in an old SCSI to SD mounting kit, which gives me nice easy access to the SD card. You just pop it right in there, connect your SCSI connector up to here, make sure you have your termination correct, although this is a self-terminating board. You can see here I don't have my power connector hooked up because my Amiga 3000 that I have here is supplying plenty of power for it. Works great. And your actual SCSI hard drive is virtualized right here on an SD card. I've got a micro SD card that's in an adapter. This uses full-size SD cards. They do make a model that's just micro SD. This particular card's a 64 gig, but you can use any capacity, 128 gig, 256 gig. I understand those work okay. Just remember, some older Amiga operating systems have a 4 gig limit on partition size, so you want to take that into consideration. SanDisk cards work great. Just make sure they're nice, high-speed cards. The ones that shipped with my SCSI to SD, Alex sent me some SanDisk Ultra 32 gig cards, 120 megabytes per second theoretical transfer rate. No, you won't see that on your Amiga, but the SanDisk makes a good card. Now, one crazy thing are these ZuluSCSIs are hot swappable. So in theory, you can pop the card out and pop another one in, and the ZuluSCSI will handle it just fine. Now, if you pop your card out while I'm running Deluxe Paint on here, is that going to crash your Amiga? Absolutely, 100% that's going to crash your Amiga because it's the flippin' boot drive. But if you can, think about the fact that you could have like a second one in here as a secondary drive, you could hot swap the hard drive as long as your hardware, like your Amiga, supports that. You can theoretically hot swap it. Don't do it though. Now let's take a look at how we actually create the little partitions and the files that are required for this thing to work. Come on over, look at my PC. So let's go ahead and create a new HDF file on here. Let me show you how this whole thing works. First, I'm going to plug my 32 gigabyte SD card into my little Windows 11 laptop here, and we want to format this, and let me show you what we need to format it as. You want to format it as exFAT right here. Now it'll work with FAT32, but exFAT will support file sizes greater than 4 gigabytes, and that's what you want, because you want to create like maybe a 4 gig, 8 gig, 16 gig, 32 gig hard file on here, and only exFAT's going to support that, not FAT32. That's limited to 4 gigs. So we're going to go ahead and format this little guy right here. Happy day. Now we have a formatted SD card. Now let's go ahead and launch WinUAE. Now what happens if you're using a Mac or a Linux machine that does not natively support the exFAT file system? Well, throw the darn piece of junk in the garbage and go buy a real computer. That's the answer. Or you could just get one of the many utilities that will add exFAT compatibility to those computers. Once you get into WinUAE, we simply want to go to CD and hard drives. We want to go to Add Hard File, and look at this cool thing down here. New hard disk image file. You want to give it a size. You give it a size in megabytes. So let's say we want to create a 1 gigabyte partition. We do 1,000 megabytes. 2,000 would be 2 gigabytes. 4,000 would be 4 gigabytes, and so on. Now we're going to keep this simple because we don't want to take it forever for it to create the file. So we're going to go ahead and create a 512 megabyte hard file that we're going to use with our ZuluSCSI. We're going to click Create, and it's going to work its magic, and we're going to go ahead and create it right on our SD card. And we're going to call this HD0.HDA, and there's a specific reason we're going to use that we're going to talk about. So we're going to go ahead and create it there. Okay, so it's created the file. We'll go ahead and get out of here for now, and let's go look at our file that we created here. SDHC, there it is, HD0.HDA, 524 kilobytes, 524,000 kilobytes, 512 megs. Now, look at these naming conventions here. HD0.HDA. Most hard files are going to be created using the HDF or the .img file extension. If your program you use to create a hard file does that, just rename it .HDA. The HD0 here, what that stands for is hard drive. Okay, this could also be CD or could F, I think it's FP for floppy. 0 is the unit number from 1 through 7. Okay, so this is SCSI ID 0. We could do SCSI ID 1. We could do SCSI ID 2 right here. Now, you can also put in a loon number. That's a logical unit number. Underscore 512 for the number of sectors there, but you don't need to do that. It only handles one loon, so you may as well just do it like this, HD0.HDA. That will literally show up as a 512 megabyte hard drive on the Amiga, as we'll see in a minute. Now, this is really cool here. I'll just take this and I'll copy it and I'll paste it. Now, I have a second copy of the file. I'm going to go ahead and rename it here. We're going to call this HD1.HDA. Now, when we plug this in the Amiga 3000 in a minute, it's going to see two distinct hard drives, not two partitions, because we could partition these 512 meg hard drives any way we want to on the Amiga. It's going to see it as two hard drives. So if you want to have 7 different hard drives show up on your Amiga, each one you could partition any way you want to, you just name them HD0, HD1, HD2, and so on. And remember, this can be any size. We're using 512 megs just for the sake of brevity, but I could make these 4 gigabyte, I could make them 128 gigabyte, as long as your Amiga supports hard drives that size, like you're using AmigaOS 3.14 and above. There's no real, limit. Well, there is a limit, but it's a fairly good limit. Let's go ahead and pop this out and pop it into the Amiga 3000 and see what we have to do next. Now, while we could keep our little SD card here right in our PC and use WinUAE to install AmigaOS on here, then bring it to the Amiga 3000, we're going to actually do it on my bare naked Amiga 3000 itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put our new little drive into our new little ZuluSCSI. To install it, I'm going to use this awesome little thing. I've talked about this before. This is from Eduarana. This is sort of like an external Gotek. Plugs right into the disk drive port, works exactly like a Gotek on the external drive. Fantastic little device. So I'm going to plug this in and we're going to get going. Now, when I boot from the floppy emulator here, I just did the 2-finger salute when you boot up. Comes up to boot options, and in my case, I'm going to choose DF2. That's the external boot device here. I'm going to make sure it's set to install disk. Fun fact, this ability to boot from whatever boot devices are in the Amiga that we had back in 1990, the PC came up with this feature to hold down a button and choose a boot device like 20 years later. Isn't that awesome? Go PC! So glad you won the computer wars. Yay, 20 years later. So here we are, booted up onto our install 3.2 disk here. Now, first thing we're going to do is get rid of this darn backdrop because I absolutely hate the backdrop. We're going to go to our install 3.2 and then we're going to define our hard drives. Now, first thing I'm going to do, because AmigaOS 3.14 and above has a little bug where when you define a hard drive, it creates this little file and it cannot be overwritten. So when we define the hard drive in here, you'll see what I'm talking about. we see these two hard drives. That's great. We're going to do change drive type, define new, so it knows what it is. If you just keep this word here the same, drive definitions, you can use that exactly one time to define a drive, and then that file name cannot ever be overwritten again. So we're going to do Zulu1. We're going to tell it to read the configuration. All right, 503 megabytes, that's fine. We're going to click OK and OK. Now, it's changed, that's fine, we're going to save. This is our second drive. Remember, we did one on address 1, address 2. Change drive type, define new. Now, if I used Zulu1 again to try and define it, it would not be able to overwrite that. It'd give me an error message. So I'm going to call that Zulu2. I don't remember that happening with AmigaOS 3.1. I think it's a bug that was introduced and they've just never fixed it. Okay, now we have two of them. We've got drive 1 and drive 2. Let's go in here to partition drive. Look at that, a 512 meg hard drive. Nice. We're going to go ahead and create a big 512 megabyte partition. 495 megs is what it sees. We're going to make that bootable. ZDH0 is fine as the name. Direct SCSI transfer is fine here. You want to click on change. Now, with a 512 megabyte hard drive, you're fine using a file block size this size. If you use a gigabyte, 4 gigs, 8 gigs, 16, 32 gigs, you need to change this block size. Good rule of thumb is, you know, for a gig partition, use 1024, 4 gig, use 2048, 8 gig, 4096, 16 gig, you're going to want to use 8192, and as your file size goes up, your block size has to go up correspondingly. If you don't, it will use up so much RAM if it ever has to verify the drive that you'll run out of memory unless you have a huge amount of memory. Just use that. Just do that. Okay. And then 30 buffers is fine. We don't really care. We're going to do OK. OK. Change that one. Now, let's also partition the second drive just for laughs. You know what? We're going to do ZDH1, and we're going to do this one 250, yeah, ZDH2. Neither of those should be bootable. Let's go ahead and do direct SCSI transfer, and we can keep the size the same. That's fine. Now we're going to save and reboot. Now looky here, when we reboot, we have 3 hard drives, all of them uninitialized, ZDH0, 1, and 2. Let's go ahead and format these. And we're going to call this one, because it's bootable, Workbench. We're going to call this one Slobber Pig. We're going to call this one Goat Monkey, because we are in a silly mood. We have literally just created 3 different partitions on 2 virtual hard drives. This one, called Workbench, is a 512 megabyte partition on 1 virtual hard drive. This is about a 250 gig each, somewhere in that area, partitioned on a second virtual hard drive. These now work as standard hard drives on the Amiga, and I can go ahead and install AmigaOS 3.2 on here, which I'm going to do off camera because it's really boring. And now we've booted up our freshly installed system. We've got Workbench on here. Everything works just great. Performance is pretty darn good. no problem at all. But look at this. I've got something on here that says AmigaOS 3 CD. How did that get here? Well, while you weren't looking, I copied over the AmigaOS 3.2 ISO file onto my SD card. I renamed it CD2, so it would be the second SCSI device. And then you go into devs on here and storage, and you would copy over this file called CD0. Normally it's under storage. Copy over CD0 into your DOS drivers, and then as soon as you reboot, it sees that ISO image and it comes up. So isn't that cool? You just got your own CD on here right now with using any ISO file. That is really, really cool. Let's take a look at one of the installations I've already done, my standard Amiga 3000 installation. So this is my standard install here. I've got 120 or 2.1 gigabyte partition for Workbench. I've got this nice 12 gigabyte partition for my work partition, and then I've got a second drive, virtual drive, that's 32 gigs on here. I haven't filled anything up with it yet. Now, as far as performance, I get about 3.2 gigabits per second out of my, yeah, that'd be nice, 3.2 megabytes per second out of my SCSI on here. And I get that because I use this program called SCSI Prefs on my Amiga 3000. Go into here, you tell it to use synchronous transfer mode, and you save that. And then what that does is that switches from the default asynchronous mode that the Amiga 3000 uses over to synchronous mode, and you get about a 50% performance boost on your SCSI. And when you use a program like the absolutely perfect, never has any flaws, everybody loves it, nobody ever complains, sysinfo. Now, sysinfo's drive speed is not a perfect thing. It really is just checking the speed of the interface, not as much the speed of the data, but I've clocked this against other things, and it's actually fairly close. I'm getting about 3.276 megabytes per second out of all my my SCSI devices on here, which is pretty good. 2.89 there, 2.8, yeah, so it's pretty good. Without that synchronous setting, I was getting about 2.1 consistently, so it adds a pretty good performance boost to it. So in my lovely Amiga 3000, there's my VLab, there's my AD516 16-bit audio card. This little guy right down there is my Fastlane Z3, which gives me 64 megs of RAM, and well, you can't really see it, but it also has Fast SCSI 2. So you may be wondering, Douglas, why aren't you using the Fast SCSI 2 on that card and instead using your SCSI 2 on the Amiga 3000? Because the Fastlane is a little bit buggy on some Amiga 3000s. So you can go in and you can find all kinds of history of it, working perfect for some people and a little flaky for others. With me, it gives me some weird errors now and again. It absolutely functions, but it gives me these weird problems. Like I can't run a AmigaOS update when I'm using the Fastlane. It's really weird, but I can switch it back over to my onboard. The update works fine. But when I am using my Fastlane Z3 down here, I can easily get 6.5 megabytes per second data transfer, almost double onboard there. Pretty cool, actually. That's a nice device. So this entire thing can be set up in minutes. The longest thing is the creation of the HDA files on your PC. You know, when I created my 32 gig HDA file, 15-20 minutes, something like that, to create it. It takes a little time depending on the speed of your computer. The 512 meg one I just made, that took like 45 seconds or a minute to create. Now the other cool thing is you can actually take an existing Amiga installation on something like your compact flash card. If you have an Amiga installation on one of these, this was my Amiga 1200 installation. You take this thing, put it in your PC. You launch WinUAE, and basically you go to the same interface to create a hard disk file, but you tell it to add the hard disk, okay? Then you tell it to create an HDF file from your hard disk. It'll take everything here, OS, programs, the data files, everything, and create an HDF file, okay? That's the same size as your compact flash card. You copy that over to the SD card for your ZuluSCSI, that new HDF file you created, you rename it HD0.HDA, you put it in your darn ZuluSCSI in your machine, and it boots using the old installation from a totally different Amiga. Is really cool. That's also a cool tip to use to back up your Amigas. You've got compact flash cards in all your Amigas probably. Take them, put them in your PC, make an HDF file of them once a month, once every other month. Worst happens, you lose data on your card crashes or something like that. You've got a backup of your data right on WinUAE, and you can use any one of those to pop onto your ZuluSCSI, and there you go. Pretty cool. So where can you get these little gems, these little ZuluSCSIs? Well, my friend Alex Perez, who's very involved in this project, has them on his RabbitHole Computing website, which I've got right down there, and very reasonably priced. They have kits to build your own starting at about $42, $43, pre-built ones for like $50, $60. A couple of variations, different size SD cards you can use, micro or full size. You can also get them from Amiga Kit. They're a fully authorized reseller of these, and I believe they make them themselves. Amiga Kit's awesome, you guys know that, and here's their link right here. And there's a couple other vendors who sell them too. Get one, get two, get three, they're fantastic. So what's my opinion of the ZuluSCSI? Well, I like it better than my SCSI to SD 5.1. Number one, it's faster. Number two, it's easier to configure. I don't mind configuring the SCSI to SDs, but this is just a little step easier. It's about on par speed-wise with my SCSI to SD 6.1. ZuluSCSI might edge out the performance a little bit, 10 or 15%, which is nice, but the ability to configure it so easily is a bonus. I like it better than all my SCSI to SDs, although I love those. Huge thanks to my awesome patrons who you see scrolling across this new promo for Amiga Art Contest 2023, which, by the way, this was 100% created on my Amiga. I took all the files, the music, everything. That's all done in the Amiga 600. Now, if you're interested in helping the channel, pop on over to patreon.com/10mark, and for as little as $2 a month, you can help support the show. And if you want more information on this year's Amiga Art Contest, which runs until November 11th, pop on over to www.amigaartwork.com. Thanks everybody, I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining me today. Please like and subscribe, and comment below about what you use for a hard drive solution on your Amiga. I want to hear about everything. Follow me on Twitter. Yes, I said Twitter, and I'm going to continue to say Twitter until that heap of garbage just burns on fire and flares out, which I think is probably going to be within the next 6 months. You can also reach me on Blue Sky, on Threads, on Mastodon, on Instagram, and Facebook. So follow me all those places. I try to post fairly frequently. But until next time, this is Doug from 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, signing out.